Welcome back. We just in the previous video introduced you to the patrician side of Roman government, and now we're going to talk about the plebeian side. So again, remember that the patrician side refers to the families in the senatorial class. These are families whose members are descended from the original Roman senators or the descendants of Roman senators. And the senatorial class, the aristocracy, is separate in many ways from the general citizen body, in many ways, including which that the members of the senatorial class could not intermarry into members of any of the plebeian families. So now, with that kind of a split, we must understand that the plebeians are in a position without having originally any access at all to any of the those offices we mentioned in the previous video that are specifically reserved for the senatorial class, can never be certain that they will receive fair representation in Roman government. So, of course, this is going to lead to unrest very quickly, and there will be a reaction thereafter. So, first of all, the plebeians are essentially, for obvious reasons, at odds with the patricians. The plebeians are in a position of not receiving any type of fair representation from the Senate and the other members of the patrician class. There's never going to be any confidence, for good reason, that the patricians will look out for the interests of the plebeians. There's no reason why they should. They're up there on top, and that's all there is to it. So, the original patrician government was clearly ensconced with patricians in place. And there are even political terms in the Latin language for the type of position that's what we would probably today call conservative, which is to say trying to maintain power up at the top and not allowing members of the citizen body down below to exceed up to the top and be able to eventually share power with the people up at the top. That will come out more in later videos, but you should be aware that there is indeed such a thing as a crust, so to speak, of aristocracy up at the top that's trying to keep everybody down and not sharing in the same government that they themselves have. All right, so with the understanding that the plebeian interests and patrician interests are frequently fundamentally at odds, we should see that there was, in fact, a place where the two sides did intersect. The position of aedile, although originally a patrician one, was in fact carried over into the plebeian body, and it was not uncommon for aediles to be plebeians. So the position of aedile did eventually find a place in the plebeian cursus honorum, and that was one of the key positions one could hold before going up the ranks into what we have down here. All right, now there was an assembly, a general Roman assembly of the populace, of those who would be serving together with the government to approve legislation on behalf of the populace. Typically, the original assembly would have been a patrician-run one. But now what happens is that in 494 BC, which is 15 years after the foundation of the Roman Republic, the plebeians united, joined together in a secessio. In doing so, carrying out this act of secession, the plebeians organized their own government, which included aediles. And the person up at the top of the plebeian body was called a tribune, tribunus in Latin. There, in fact, were three of them, which is why the term tribune is used, referring to a group of three. And then there was a separate concilium, the council, the assembly, that would have been specifically for the plebeians. The plebeian government was supposed, especially the concilium, was supposed to be able to pass legislation that, once passed, would have served as law to the same extent as any laws passed by the patrician senate. Not surprisingly, the aristocratic portion of the Roman population thought this was all ridiculous. However, the plebeians outnumbered the patricians by quite a bit. And just through the force of numbers, and again with gradual developments in Roman society, Roman social political thinking, it eventually worked out that the plebeians were able to receive more direct and pertinent representation from all parts of Roman government, not just their own specific parts. Now, obviously, anything that the plebeians do in their own government is not going to do any good for them unless they could actually have a means of directly challenging the authority of the patrician government where necessary. So this is the real key spot at which plebeian and patrician interests could especially cross swords. And it's right here. This is the intercessio. Intercessio is a special universal veto power that is granted to the head of the three tribunes, who is known as the tribunus plebis, the tribune of the plebs. He has a special veto that allows him, without any hope of override, to interdict any legislation passed by the patrician senate deemed unsatisfactory to the plebeians, doing anything that might potentially be contrary to the interests of the plebeian body. The tribunus plebis is capable of standing up and simply saying, no, this legislation is banned. And that would put an end to it. That could include, by the way, not necessarily just laws, but for instance, appointments. As, for example, in a key incident that's going to happen much later in history, should the Senate want to appoint a particular military campaign, let's say to one of the patrician body, the tribunus plebis could block that and then go to the assembly and ask for some plebeian commander to be put in the place of that patrician commander. And if that went through, that would be the person who would go through, and there would not necessarily be much the Senate could do about it unless they wanted to take up arms or carry out some type of murder or some other means of gently forcing their way by knife point onto the person who is giving them trouble. Okay, so that's the point, is that the plebeians have a mechanism in place with this new government of essentially telling the patrician body, no, you cannot pass this legislation, we don't allow it because we see this as bad for our own interests. Now, I want to make clear that although for right now I'm presenting the plebs as one solid body, that might have been to some extent true at the beginning, but that would gradually change over time and definitely not be true in the late Republic and the Empire. In our next video, we're going to talk about what's called the eques class, the knights, those who are wealthy enough to own horses. They're quite expensive, and therefore are essentially like a business class that has made their way financially, economically, through entrepreneurship or other forms of business. They do not, however, have the family pedigree of the senatorial class. So they're one class right below it. So that is one of the developments that will come up eventually out of the more evolved plebeian class that we'll see somewhat later. For right now, though, I will point you to these two dates, 367 and 342 BC. So this is a good century and a quarter to a half after the Successio. After a lot of struggle internally within Rome, it was finally agreed with pieces of legislation in these 2 years that first, 367 BC, a plebeian could go through the patrician cursus honorum and could eventually become consul. So it was permitted for one of the two consuls to be plebeian. 342 BC went further and now required that one of the two consuls needed to be at least partly of plebeian ancestry, and that therefore it would no longer be permitted for two entirely patrician blooded members of the population to occupy the two consulships at the same time. At least one needed to be descended from plebeians. So that major change meant that now plebeians could serve in the government alongside patricians. That would, of course, mean, and we'll talk about this in the next video, that could mean that you could now have plebeians who might be capable of ascending the ranks faster than some of their other fellow plebeians. So in a way, although we do modify the problem by eliminating the direct division between patricians on top and plebeians down below, we don't really solve the inequity completely, because what we really more do is we still keep the patricians up at the top, but now we elongate the plebeian class to be able to reach up to the ranks of the patricians. So now we've got it's almost you can imagine the class as being sort of like something ductile that would like stretch. So you have the plebeians, but now they stretch. Some of them go on up and make it their way to the patrician side. Those are the ones who will become the equites, and the rest of the plebeian body is still down here as potentially unrepresented as ever. So we don't really fix the problem, we just modify its nature. And again, some of these tensions between now three groups of people, patricians, wealthy plebeians, and poorer plebeians, will become of great importance as we study the late Republic that will eventually turn into the Empire, celebrated sort of reluctantly by both Virgil and Ovid in their two epic works. Okay, so there's the introduction to the plebeian government. The big important points here are that is that original Secessio, 494 BC, that originally created the plebeian government, basically putting the plebeians and the patricians at odds right from the beginning. That's one thing. And then again, this really key thing, the intercessio, the veto, that the tribunus plebis has an absolute power over legislation or other action taken by the patrician senate. Okay, in our next video, we will explore further these social and political civics in the Roman state. We'll see you next video.